Section 11 of Myths and Legends. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lauren Lazarus. Myths and Legends of Ancient Greece and Rome by EM Berens. Hermes, Mercury. Hermes was the swift-footed messenger and trusted ambassador of all the gods, and conductor of shades to Hades. He presided over the rearing and education of the young, and encouraged gymnastic exercises and athletic pursuits, for which reason all gymnasiums and wrestling schools throughout Greece were adorned with his statues. He is said to have invented the alphabet, and to have taught the art of interpreting foreign languages, and his versatility, sagacity, and cunning were so extraordinary that Zeus invariably chose him as his attendant when, disguised as a mortal, he journeyed on earth. Hermes was worshipped as god of eloquence, most probably from the fact that, in his office as ambassador, this faculty was indispensable to the successful issue of the negotiations with which he was entrusted. He was regarded as the god who granted increase and prosperity to flocks and herds, and on this account was worshipped with special veneration by herdsmen. In ancient times, trade was conducted chiefly by means of the exchange of cattle. Hermes, therefore, as god of herdsmen, came to be regarded as the protector of merchants, and as ready wit and adroitness are valuable qualities both in buying and selling, he was also looked upon as the patron of artifice and cunning. Indeed, so deeply was this notion rooted in the minds of the Greek people that he was popularly believed to be also the god of thieves, and of all persons who live by their wits. As the patron of commerce, Hermes was naturally supposed to be the promoter of intercourse among nations. Hence, he is essentially the god of travelers, over whose safety he presided, and he severely punished those who refused assistance to the lost or weary wayfarer. He was also guardian of streets and roads, and his statues, called Hermae, which were pillars of stone surmounted by a head of Hermes, were placed at crossroads, and frequently in streets and public squares. Being the god of all undertakings in which gain was a feature, he was worshipped as the giver of wealth and good luck, and any unexpected stroke of fortune was attributed to his influence. He also presided over the game of dice, in which he is said to have been instructed by Apollo. Hermes was the son of Zeus and Maia, the eldest and most beautiful of the 7 Pleiades, daughters of Atlas, and was born in a cave of Mount Cyllene in Arcadia. As a mere babe, he exhibited an extraordinary faculty for cunning and dissimulation. In fact, he was a thief from his cradle, for not many hours after his birth, we find him creeping stealthily out of the cave in which he was born, in order to steal some oxen belonging to his brother Apollo, who was at this time feeding the flocks of Admetus. But he had not proceeded very far on his expedition before he found a tortoise, which he killed, and stretching 7 strings across the empty shell, invented a lyre, upon which he at once began to play with exquisite skill. When he had sufficiently amused himself with the instrument, he placed it in his cradle, and then resumed his journey to Pieria, where the cattle of Admetus were grazing. Arriving at sunset at his destination, he succeeded in separating 50 oxen from his brother's herd, which he now drove before him, taking the precaution to cover his feet with sandals made of twigs of myrtle, in order to escape detection. But the little rogue was not unobserved, for the theft had been witnessed by an old shepherd named Thetis, who was tending the flocks of Neleus, king of Pylos, father of Nestor. Hermes, frightened at being discovered, bribed him with the finest cow in the herd not to betray him, and Thetis promised to keep the secret. But Hermes, astute as he was dishonest, determined to test the shepherd's integrity. Feigning to go away, he assumed the form of Admetus, and then returning to the spot, offered the old man 2 of his best oxen if he would disclose the author of the theft. The ruse succeeded, for the avaricious shepherd, unable to resist the tempting bait, gave the desired information, upon which Hermes, exerting his divine power, changed him into a lump of touchstone, as a punishment for his treachery and avarice. Hermes now killed 2 of the oxen, which he sacrificed to himself and the other gods, concealing the remainder in the cave. He then carefully extinguished the fire, and after throwing his twig shoes into the river Alpheus, returned to Cyllene. Apollo, by means of his all-seeing power, soon discovered who it was that had robbed him, and hastening to Cyllene, demanded restitution of his property. On his complaining to Maia of her son's conduct, she pointed to the innocent babe then lying apparently fast asleep in his cradle, whereupon Apollo angrily aroused the pretended sleeper and charged him with the theft. But the child stoutly denied all knowledge of it, and so cleverly did he play his part that he even inquired in the most naive manner what sort of animals cows were. Apollo threatened to throw him into Tartarus if he would not confess the truth, but all to no purpose. At last he seized the babe in his arms and brought him into the presence of his august father, who was seated in the council chamber of the gods. Zeus listened to the charge made by Apollo, and then sternly desired Hermes to say where he had hidden the cattle. The child, who was still in swaddling clothes, looked up bravely into his father's face and said, "Now, do I look capable of driving away a herd of cattle? I, who was only born yesterday, and whose feet are much too soft and tender to tread in rough places? Until this moment I lay in sweet sleep on my mother's bosom, and have never even crossed the threshold of our dwelling. You know well that I am not guilty, but if you wish, I will affirm it by the most solemn oaths." As the child stood before him, looking the picture of innocence, Zeus could not refrain from smiling at his cleverness and cunning, but being perfectly aware of his guilt, he commanded him to conduct Apollo to the cave where he had concealed the herd, and Hermes, seeing that further subterfuge was useless, unhesitatingly obeyed. But when the divine shepherd was about to drive his cattle back into Pieria, Hermes, as though by chance, touched the chords of his lyre. Hitherto Apollo had heard nothing but the music of his own 3-stringed lyre and the syrinx, or Pan's pipe, and as he listened entranced to the delightful strains of this new instrument, his longing to possess it became so great that he gladly offered the oxen in exchange, promising at the same time to give Hermes full dominion over flocks and herds, as well as over horses and all the wild animals of the woods and forests. The offer was accepted, and, a reconciliation being thus effected between the brothers, Hermes became henceforth god of herdsmen, whilst Apollo devoted himself enthusiastically to the art of music. They now proceeded together to Olympus, where Apollo introduced Hermes as his chosen friend and companion, and having made him swear by the Styx that he would never steal his lyre or bow, nor invade his sanctuary at Delphi, he presented him with the caduceus, or golden wand. This wand was surmounted by wings, and on presenting it to Hermes, Apollo informed him that it possessed the faculty of uniting in love all beings divided by hate. Wishing to prove the truth of this assertion, Hermes threw it down between 2 snakes which were fighting, whereupon the angry combatants clasped each other in a loving embrace, and curling round the staff, remained ever after permanently attached to it. The wand itself typified power, the serpents wisdom, and the wings despatch, all qualities characteristic of a trustworthy ambassador. The young god was now presented by his father with a winged silver cap, Thetis, and also with silver wings for his feet, Talaria, and was forthwith appointed herald of the gods, and conductor of shades to Hades, which office had hitherto been filled by Aedes. As messenger of the gods, we find him employed on all occasions requiring special skill, tact, or despatch. Thus he conducts Hera, Athene, and Aphrodite to Paris, leads Priam to Achilles to demand the body of Hector, binds Prometheus to Mount Caucasus, secures Ixion to the eternally revolving wheel, destroys Argus, the 100-eyed guardian of Io, etc., etc. As conductor of shades, Hermes was always invoked by the dying to grant them a safe and speedy passage across the Styx. He also possessed the power of bringing back departed spirits to the upper world, and was, therefore, the mediator between the living and the dead. The poets relate many amusing stories of the youthful tricks played by this mischief-loving god upon the other immortals. For instance, he had the audacity to extract the Medusa's head from the shield of Athene, which he playfully attached to the back of Hephaestus. He also stole the girdle of Aphrodite, deprived Artemis of her arrows, and Ares of his spear. But these acts were always performed with such graceful dexterity, combined with such perfect good humor, that even the gods and goddesses he thus provoked were fain to pardon him, and he became a universal favorite with them all. It is said that Hermes was one day flying over Athens, when looking down into the city he beheld a number of maidens returning in solemn procession from the temple of Pallas Athene. Foremost among them was Circe, the beautiful daughter of King Cecrops, and Hermes was so struck with her exceeding loveliness that he determined to seek an interview with her. He accordingly presented himself at the royal palace, and begged her sister Agraulos to favor his suit, but being of an avaricious turn of mind, she refused to do so without the payment of an enormous sum of money. It did not take the messenger of the gods long to obtain the means of fulfilling this condition, and he soon returned with a well-filled purse. But meanwhile, Athene, to punish the cupidity of Agraulos, had caused the demon of envy to take possession of her, and the consequence was that, being unable to contemplate the happiness of her sister, she sat down before the door and resolutely refused to allow Hermes to enter. He tried every persuasion and blandishment in his power, but she still remained obstinate. At last, his patience being exhausted, he changed her into a mass of black stone, and the obstacle to his wishes being removed, he succeeded in persuading Circe to become his wife. In his statues, Hermes is represented as a beardless youth, with broad chest and graceful but muscular limbs. The face is handsome and intelligent, and a genial smile of kindly benevolence plays round the delicately chiseled lips. As messenger of the gods, he wears the petasus and talaria, and bears in his hand the caduceus or herald's staff. As god of eloquence, he is often represented with chains of gold hanging from his lips, whilst as the patron of merchants he bears a purse in his hand. The wonderful excavations in Olympia, to which allusion has already been made, have brought to light an exquisite marble group of Hermes and the infant Bacchus by Praxiteles. In this great work of art, Hermes is represented as a young and handsome man, who is looking down kindly and affectionately at the child resting on his arm. But unfortunately nothing remains of the infant save the right hand, which is laid lovingly on the shoulder of his protector. The sacrifices to Hermes consisted of incense, honey, cakes, pigs, and especially lambs and young goats. As god of eloquence, the tongues of animals were sacrificed to him. Mercury. Mercury was the Roman god of commerce and gain. We find mention of a temple having been erected to him near the Circus Maximus as early as BC 495, and he also had a temple and a sacred fount near the Porta Capena. Magic powers were ascribed to the latter, and on the festival of Mercury, which took place on the 25th of May, it was the custom for merchants to sprinkle themselves and their merchandise with this holy water, in order to ensure large profits from their wares. The Fetiales, Roman priests whose duty it was to act as guardians of the public faith, refused to recognize the identity of Mercury with Hermes, and ordered him to be represented with a sacred branch as the emblem of peace, instead of the caduceus. In later times, however, he was completely identified with the Greek Hermes. End of section 11.
Section 12 of Myths and Legends. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or how to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Myths and Legends of Ancient Greece by EM Berens. Section 12. Dionysus, Bacchus. Dionysus, also called Bacchus from Bacca, berry, was the god of wine and the personification of the blessings of nature in general. The worship of this divinity, which is supposed to have been introduced into Greece from Asia, in all probability from India, first took root in Thrace, whence it gradually spread into other parts of Greece. Dionysus was the son of Zeus and Semele, and was snatched by Zeus from the devouring flames in which his mother perished, when he appeared to her in all the splendor of his divine glory. The motherless child was entrusted to the charge of Hermes, who conveyed him to Semele's sister, Ino. But Hera, still implacable in her vengeance, visited Alphemus, the husband of Ino, with madness, and the child's life being no longer safe, he was transferred to the fostering care of the nymphs of Mount Nysa. An aged satyr named Silenus, the son of Pan, took upon himself the office of guardian and preceptor to the young god, who, in his turn, became much attached to his tutor. Hence we see Silenus always figuring as one of the chief personages in the various expeditions of the wine god. Dionysus passed an innocent and uneventful childhood, roaming through the woods and forests, surrounded by nymphs, satyrs, and shepherds. During one of these rambles he found a fruit growing wild of a most refreshing and cooling nature. This was the vine from which he subsequently learnt to extract a juice which formed a most exhilarating beverage. After his companions had partaken freely of it, they felt their whole being pervaded by an unwonted sense of pleasurable excitement, and gave full vent to their overflowing exuberance by shouting, singing, and dancing. Their numbers were soon swelled by a crowd eager to taste a beverage productive of such extraordinary results, and anxious to join in the worship of a divinity to whom they were indebted for this new enjoyment. Dionysus, on his part, seeing how agreeably his discovery had affected his immediate followers, resolved to extend the boon to mankind in general. He saw that wine used in moderation would enable man to enjoy a happier and more sociable existence, and that, under its invigorating influence, the sorrowful might for a while forget their grief, and the sick their pain. He accordingly gathered round him his zealous followers, and they set forth on their travels, planting the vine and teaching it cultivation wherever they went. We now behold Dionysus at the head of a large army composed of men, women, fauns, and satyrs, all bearing in their hands the Thetis, a staff entwined with vine branches surmounted by a fir cone, and clashing together cymbals and other musical instruments. Seated in a chariot drawn by panthers and accompanied by thousands of enthusiastic followers, Dionysus made a triumphal progress through Syria, Egypt, Arabia, India, etc., conquering all before him, founding cities, and establishing on every side a more civilized and sociable mode of life among the inhabitants of the various countries through which he passed. When Dionysus returned to Greece from his eastern expedition, he encountered great opposition from Lycurgus, king of Thrace, and Pentheus, king of Thebes. The former, highly disapproving of the wild revels which attended the worship of the wine god, drove away his attendants, the nymphs of Nysa, from that sacred mountain, and so effectually intimidated Dionysus that he precipitated himself into the sea, where he was received into the arms of the ocean nymph, Thetis. But the impious king bitterly expiated his sacrilegious conduct. He was punished with the loss of his reason, and, during one of his mad paroxysms, killed his own son Dryas, whom he mistook for a vine. Pentheus, king of Thebes, seeing his subjects so completely infatuated by the riotous worship of this new divinity, and fearing the demoralizing effects of the unseemly nocturnal orgies held in honor of the wine god, strictly prohibited his people from taking any part in the wild bacchanalian revels. Anxious to save him from the consequences of his impiety, Dionysus appeared to him under the form of a youth in the king's train and earnestly warned him to desist from his denunciations. But the well-meant admonition failed in its purpose, for Pentheus only became more incensed at this interference, and commanding Dionysus to be cast into prison, caused the most cruel preparations to be made for his immediate execution. But the god soon freed himself from his ignoble confinements, for scarcely had his jailers departed ere the prison doors opened of themselves, and bursting asunder his iron chains, he escaped to rejoin his devoted followers. Meanwhile, the mother of the king and her sisters, inspired with bacchanalian fury, had repaired to Mount Cithron, in order to join the worshippers of the wine god in those dreadful orgies which were solemnized exclusively by women, and at which no man was allowed to be present. Enraged at finding his commands thus openly disregarded by the members of his own family, Pentheus resolved to witness for himself the excesses of which he had heard such terrible reports, and for this purpose concealed himself behind a tree on Mount Cithron. But his hiding place being discovered, he was dragged out by the half-maddened crew of Bacchantes, and, horrible to relate, he was torn in pieces by his own mother, Agave, and her two sisters. An incident which occurred to Dionysus on one of his travels has been a favorite subject with the classical poets. One day, as some Tyrrhenian pirates approached the shores of Greece, they beheld Dionysus in the form of a beautiful youth, attired in radiant garments. Thinking to secure a rich prize, they seized him, bound him, and conveyed him on board their vessel, resolved to carry him with them to Asia and there sell him as a slave. But the fetters dropped from his limbs, and the pilot, who was the first to perceive the miracle, called upon his companions to restore the youth carefully to the spot whence they had taken him, assuring them that he was a god, and that adverse winds and storms would, in all probability, result from their impious conduct. But, refusing to part with their prisoner, they set sail for the open sea. Suddenly, to the alarm of all on board, the ship stood still, masts and sails were covered with clustering vines and wreaths of ivy leaves, streams of fragrant wine inundated the vessel, and heavenly strains of music were heard around. The terrified crew, too late repentant, crowded round the pilot for protection, and entreated him to steer for the shore. But the hour of retribution had arrived. Dionysus assumed the form of a lion, whilst beside him appeared a bear, which with a terrific roar rushed upon the captain and tore him in pieces. The sailors, in an agony of terror, leaped overboard and were changed into dolphins. The discreet and pious steersman was alone permitted to escape the fate of his companions, and to him Dionysus, who had resumed his true form, addressed words of kind and affectionate encouragement, and announced his name and dignity. They now set sail, and Dionysus desired the pilot to land him at the island of Naxos, where he found the lovely Ariadne, daughter of Minos, king of Crete. She had been abandoned by Thetis on this lonely spot, and when Dionysus now beheld her, was lying fast asleep on a rock, worn out with sorrow and weeping. Wrapped in admiration, the god stood gazing at the beautiful vision before him, and when she at length unclosed her eyes, he revealed himself to her and, in gentle tones, sought to banish her grief. Grateful for his kind sympathy, coming as it did at the moment when she had deemed herself forsaken and friendless, she gradually regained her former serenity and, yielding to his entreaties, consented to become his wife. Dionysus, having established his worship in various parts of the world, descended to the realm of shades in search of his ill-fated mother, whom he conducted to Olympus, where, under the name of Thyone, she was admitted into the assembly of the immortal gods. Among the most noted worshippers of Dionysus was Midas, the wealthy king of Phrygia, the same who, as already related, gave judgment against Apollo. Upon one occasion, Silenus, the preceptor and friend of Dionysus, being in an intoxicated condition, strayed into the rose gardens of this monarch, where he was found by some of the king's attendants, who bound him with roses and conducted him to the presence of their royal master. Midas treated the aged satyr with the greatest consideration, and, after entertaining him hospitably for 10 days, led him back to Dionysus, who was so grateful for the kind attention shown to his old friend that he offered to grant Midas any favor he chose to demand. Whereupon the avaricious monarch, not content with his boundless wealth and still thirsting for more, desired that everything he touched might turn into gold. The request was complied with in so literal a sense that the now wretched Midas bitterly repented his folly and cupidity, for when the pangs of hunger assailed him and he essayed to appease his cravings, the food became gold ere he could swallow it. As he raised the cup of wine to his parched lips, the sparkling draught was changed into the metal he had so coveted, and when at length, wearied and faint, he stretched his aching frame on his hitherto luxurious couch, this also was transformed into the substance which had now become the curse of his existence. The despairing king at last implored the god to take back the fatal gift, and Dionysus, pitying his unhappy plight, desired him to bathe in the river Pactolus, a small stream in Lydia, in order to lose the power which had become the bane of his life. Midas, joyfully obeying the injunction, was at once freed from the consequences of his avaricious demand, and from this time forth the sands of the river Pactolus have ever contained grains of gold. Representations of Dionysus are of two kinds. According to the earliest conceptions, he appears as a grave and dignified man in the prime of life. His countenance is earnest, thoughtful, and benevolent. He wears a full beard, and is draped from head to foot in the garb of an Eastern monarch. But the sculptors of a later period represent him as a youth of singular beauty, though of somewhat effeminate appearance. The expression of the countenance is gentle and winning, the limbs are supple and gracefully molded, and the hair, which is adorned by a wreath of vine or ivy leaves, falls over the shoulders in long curls. In one hand he bears the Thetis, and in the other a drinking cup with two handles, these being his distinguishing attributes. He is often represented riding on a panther, or seated in a chariot drawn by lions, tigers, panthers, or lynxes. Being the god of wine, which is calculated to promote sociability, he rarely appears alone, but is usually accompanied by bacchantes, satyrs, and mountain nymphs. The finest modern representation of Ariadne is that by Dannecker at Frankfurt on the Main. In this statue, she appears riding on a panther. The beautiful upturned face inclines slightly over the left shoulder. The features are regular and finely cut, and a wreath of ivy leaves encircles the well-shaped head. With her right hand, she gracefully clasps the folds of drapery which fall away negligently from her rounded form, whilst the other rests lightly and caressingly on the head of the animal. Dionysus was regarded as the patron of the drama, and at the state festival of the Dionysia, which was celebrated with great pomp in the city of Athens, dramatic entertainments took place in his honor, for which all the renowned Greek dramatists of antiquity composed their immortal tragedies and comedies. He was also a prophetic divinity and possessed oracles, the principal of which was that on Mount Rhodope in Thrace. The tiger, lynx, panther, dolphin, serpent, and ass were sacred to this god. His favorite plants were the vine, ivy, laurel, and asphodel. His sacrifices consisted of goats, probably on account of their being destructive to vineyards. Bacchus, or Liber. The Romans had a divinity called Liber who presided over vegetation and was, on this account, identified with the Greek Dionysus and worshipped under the name of Bacchus. The festival of Liber, called the Liberalia, was celebrated on the 17th of March. End of section 12. This recording by Aaron Elliott, St. Louis, Missouri.
Section 13 of Myths and Legends. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Myths and Legends of Ancient Greece and Rome by EM Berens. Hades, Pluto. Hades, Adonis, or Hades, was the son of Cronus and Rhea, and the youngest brother of Zeus and Poseidon. He was the ruler of that subterranean region called Erebus, which was inhabited by the shades or spirits of the dead, and also by those dethroned and exiled deities who had been vanquished by Zeus and his allies. Hades, the grim and gloomy monarch of this lower world, was the successor of Erebus, that ancient primeval divinity after whom these realms were called. See footnote 131. The early Greeks regarded Hades in the light of their greatest foe, and Homer tells us that he was of all the gods the most detested, being in their eyes the grim robber who stole from them their nearest and dearest, and eventually deprived each of them of their share in terrestrial existence. His name was so feared that it was never mentioned by mortals who, when they invoked him, struck the earth with their hands, and in sacrificing to him, turned away their faces. The belief of the people with regard to a future state was, in the Homeric age, a sad and cheerless one. It was supposed that when a mortal ceased to exist, his spirit tenanted the shadowy outline of the human form it had quitted. These shadows, or shades as they were called, were driven by Hades into his dominions, where they passed their time, some in brooding over the vicissitudes of fortune which they had experienced on earth, others in regretting the lost pleasures they had enjoyed in life, but all in a condition of semi-consciousness from which the intellect could only be roused to full activity by drinking of the blood of the sacrifices offered to their shades by living friends, which, for a time, endowed them with their former mental vigor. The only beings supposed to enjoy any happiness in a future state were the heroes, whose acts of daring and deeds of prowess had, during their life, reflected honor on the land of their birth, and even these, according to Homer, pined after their career of earthly activity. He tells us that when Odysseus visited the lower world at the command of Circe, and held communion with the shades of the heroes of the Trojan War, Achilles assured him that he would rather be the poorest day-laborer on earth than reign supreme over the realm of shades. The early Greek poets offer but scanty allusions to Erebus. Homer appears purposely to envelop these realms in vagueness and mystery, in order, probably, to heighten the sensation of awe inseparably connected with the lower world. See footnote 132. In the Odyssey, he describes the entrance to Erebus as being beyond the furthermost edge of Oceanus in the far west, where dwelt the Cimmerians, enveloped in eternal mists and darkness. In later times, however, in consequence of extended intercourse with foreign nations, new ideas became gradually introduced, and we find Egyptian theories with regard to a future state taking root in Greece, which become eventually the religious belief of the whole nation. It is now that the poets and philosophers, and more especially the teachers of the Eleusinian mysteries, begin to inculcate the doctrine of the future reward and punishment of good and bad deeds. Hades, who had hitherto been regarded as the dread enemy of mankind, who delights in his grim office and keeps the shades imprisoned in his dominions after withdrawing them from the joys of existence, now receives them with hospitality and friendship, and Hermes replaces him as conductor of shades to Hades. Under this new aspect, Hades usurps the functions of a totally different divinity called Plutus, the god of riches, and is henceforth regarded as the giver of wealth to mankind in the shape of those precious metals which lie concealed in the bowels of the earth. The later poets mention various entrances to Erebus, which were, for the most part, caves and fissures. There is one in the mountain of Taenarum, another in Thesprotia, and a third, the most celebrated of all, in Italy, near the pestiferous lake Avernus, over which it is said no bird could fly, so noxious were its exhalations. In the dominions of Hades there were 4 great rivers, 3 of which had to be crossed by all the shades. These 3 were Acheron, sorrow, Cocytus, lamentation, and Styx, intense darkness, the sacred stream which flowed 9 times round these realms. The shades were ferried over the Styx by the grim, unshaven old boatman, Charon, who, however, only took those whose bodies had received funeral rites on earth, and who had brought with them his indispensable toll, which was a small coin or obolus, usually placed under the tongue of a dead person for this purpose. See footnote 133. If these conditions had not been fulfilled, the unhappy shades were left behind to wander up and down the banks for 100 years as restless spirits. On the opposite bank of the Styx was the tribunal of Minos, the supreme judge before whom all shades had to appear, and who, after hearing full confession of their actions whilst on earth, pronounced the sentence of happiness or misery to which their deeds had entitled them. This tribunal was guarded by the terrible triple-headed dog Cerberus, who, with his 3 necks bristling with snakes, lay at full length on the ground, a formidable sentinel who permitted all shades to enter, but none to return. The happy spirits, destined to enjoy the delights of Elysium, passed out on the right, and proceeded to the golden palace where Hades and Persephone held their royal court, from whom they received a kindly greeting ere they set out for the Elysian fields which lay beyond. See footnote 47. This blissful region was replete with all that could charm the senses or please the imagination. The air was balmy and fragrant, rippling brooks flowed peacefully through the smiling meadows, which glowed with the varied hues of 1,000 flowers, whilst the groves resounded with the joyous songs of birds. The occupations and amusements of the happy shades were of the same nature as those which they had delighted in whilst on earth. Here the warrior found his horses, chariots, and arms, the musician his lyre, and the hunter his quiver and bow. In a secluded vale of Elysium there flowed a gentle, silent stream called Lethe, Oblivion, whose waters had the effect of dispelling care and producing utter forgetfulness of former events. According to the Pythagorean doctrine of the transmigration of souls, it was supposed that after the shades had inhabited Elysium for 1,000 years, they were destined to animate other bodies on earth, and before leaving Elysium they drank of the river Lethe, in order that they might enter upon their new career without any remembrance of the past. See footnote 134. The guilty souls, after leaving the presence of Minos, were conducted to the great judgment hall of Hades, whose massive walls of solid adamant were surrounded by the river Phlegethon, the waves of which rolled flames of fire and lit up with their lurid glare these awful realms. In the interior sat the dread judge, Rhadamanthus, who declared to each comer the precise torments which awaited him in Tartarus. The wretched sinners were then seized by the Furies, who scourged them with their whips and dragged them along to the great gate, which closed the opening to Tartarus, into whose awful depths they were hurled to suffer endless torture. Tartarus was a vast and gloomy expanse, as far below Hades as the earth is distant from the skies. There the Titans, fallen from their high estate, dragged out a dreary and monotonous existence. There also were Otis and Ephialtes, those giant sons of Poseidon who, with impious hands, had attempted to scale Olympus and dethrone its mighty ruler. Principal among the sufferers in this abode of gloom were Thetis, Tantalus, Sisyphus, Ixion, and the Dynasties. Thetis, one of the earth-born giants, had insulted Hera on her way to Pytho, for which offense Zeus flung him into Tartarus, where he suffered dreadful torture inflicted by 2 vultures, which perpetually gnawed his liver. Tantalus was a wise and wealthy king of Lydia, with whom the gods themselves condescended to associate. He was even permitted to sit at table with Zeus, who delighted in his conversation and listened with interest to the wisdom of his observations. Tantalus, however, elated at these distinguished marks of divine favor, presumed upon his position and used unbecoming language to Zeus himself. He also stole nectar and ambrosia from the table of the gods, with which he regaled his friends. But his greatest crime consisted in killing his own son, Pelops, and serving him up at one of the banquets to the gods in order to test their omniscience. See footnote 135. For these heinous offenses he was condemned by Zeus to eternal punishment in Tartarus, where, tortured with an ever-burning thirst, he was plunged up to the chin in water, which, as he stooped to drink, always receded from his parched lips. Tall trees with spreading branches laden with delicious fruits hung temptingly over his head, but no sooner did he raise himself to grasp them than a wind arose and carried them beyond his reach. Sisyphus was a great tyrant who, according to some accounts, barbarously murdered all travelers who came into his dominions by hurling upon them enormous pieces of rock. In punishment for his crimes, he was condemned to roll incessantly a huge block of stone up a steep hill, which, as soon as it reached the summit, always rolled back again to the plain below. Ixion was a king of Thessaly to whom Zeus accorded the privilege of joining the festive banquets of the gods. But taking advantage of his exalted position, he presumed to aspire to the favor of Hera, which so greatly incensed Zeus that he struck him with his thunderbolts and commanded Hermes to throw him into Tartarus and bind him to an ever-revolving wheel. The Dynasties were the 50 daughters of Danis, king of Argos, who had married their 50 cousins, the son of Aegyptus. By the command of their father, who had been warned by an oracle that his son-in-law would cause his death, they all killed their husbands in one night, Hypermnestra alone excepted. Their punishment in the lower world was to fill with water a vessel full of holes, a never-ending and useless task. Hades is usually represented as a man of mature years and stern, majestic mien, bearing a striking resemblance to his brother Zeus. But the gloomy and inexorable expression of the face contrasts forcibly with that peculiar benignity which so characterizes the countenance of the mighty ruler of heaven. He is seated on a throne of ebony with his queen, the grave and sad Persephone, beside him, and wears a full beard and long flowing black hair, which hangs straight down over his forehead. See footnote 136. In his hand he either bears a 2-pronged fork or the keys of the lower world, and at his feet sits Cerberus. He is sometimes seen in a chariot of gold, drawn by 4 black horses, and wearing on his head a helmet made for him by the Cyclops, which rendered the wearer invisible. This helmet he frequently lent to mortals and immortals. Hades, who was universally worshipped throughout Greece, had temples erected to his honor in Elis, Olympia, and also at Athens. His sacrifices, which took place at night, consisted of black sheep, and the blood, instead of being sprinkled on the altars or received in vessels, as at other sacrifices, was permitted to run down into a trench dug for this purpose. The officiating priests wore black robes and were crowned with cypress. The narcissus, maiden hair, and cypress were sacred to this divinity. Pluto. Before the introduction into Rome of the religion and literature of Greece, the Romans had no belief in a realm of future happiness or misery corresponding to the Greek Hades. Hence, they had no god of the lower world identical with Hades. They supposed that there was, in the center of the earth, a vast, gloomy, and impenetrably dark cavity called Orcus, which formed a place of eternal rest for the dead. But with the introduction of Greek mythology, the Roman Orcus became the Greek Hades, and all the Greek notions with regard to a future state now obtained with the Romans who worshipped Hades under the name of Pluto, his other appellations being Dis, from Dives, rich, and Orcus, from the dominions over which he ruled. In Rome there were no temples erected to this divinity. Plutus. Plutus, the son of Demeter, and a mortal called Iasion, was the god of wealth, and is represented as being lame when he makes his appearance, and winged when he takes his departure. He was supposed to be both blind and foolish because he bestows his gifts without discrimination, and frequently upon the most unworthy objects. Plutus was believed to have his abode in the bowels of the earth, which was probably the reason why, in later times, Hades became confounded with this divinity. End of section 13. Recording by Anthony Wilson.
Section 14 of Myths and Legends. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lauren Lazarus. Myths and Legends of Ancient Greece and Rome by EM Berens. Minor Divinities. The Harpies. The Harpies, who, like the Furies, were employed by the gods as instruments for the punishment of the guilty, were three female divinities, daughters of Thaumas and Electra, called Ilo, Ocypete, and Celaeno. They were represented with the head of a fair-haired maiden and the body of a vulture, and were perpetually devoured by the pangs of insatiable hunger, which caused them to torment their victims by robbing them of their food. This they either devoured with great gluttony, or defiled in such a manner as to render it unfit to be eaten. Their wonderfully rapid flight far surpassed that of birds, or even of the winds themselves. If any mortal suddenly and unaccountably disappeared, the Harpies were believed to have carried him off. Thus they were supposed to have borne away the daughters of King Pandarios, to act as servants to the Erinyes. The Harpies would appear to be personifications of sudden tempests, which, with ruthless violence, sweep over whole districts, carrying off or injuring all before them. Erinyes, Eumenides, Furii, Deirai. The Erinyes, or Furies, were female divinities who personified the torturing pangs of an evil conscience, and the remorse which inevitably follows wrongdoing. Their names were Alecto, Megaera, and Tisiphone, and their origin was variously accounted for. According to Hesiod, they sprang from the blood of Uranus, when wounded by Cronus, and were hence supposed to be the embodiment of all the terrible imprecations which the defeated deity called down upon the head of his rebellious son. According to other accounts, they were the daughters of Night. Their place of abode was the lower world, where they were employed by Aedes and Persephone to chastise and torment those shades who, during their earthly career, had committed crimes and had not been reconciled to the gods before descending to Hades. But their sphere of action was not confined to the realm of shades, for they appeared upon earth as the avenging deities who relentlessly pursued and punished murderers, perjurers, those who had failed in duty to their parents, in hospitality to strangers, or in the respect due to old age. Nothing escaped the piercing glance of these terrible divinities, from whom flight was unavailing, for no corner of the earth was so remote as to be beyond their reach, nor did any mortal dare to offer to their victims an asylum from their persecutions. The Furies are frequently represented with wings. Their bodies are black, blood drips from their eyes, and snakes twine in their hair. In their hands they bear either a dagger, scourge, torch, or serpent. When they pursued Orestes, they constantly held up a mirror to his horrified gaze, in which he beheld the face of his murdered mother. These divinities were also called Eumenides, which signifies the well-meaning or soothed goddesses. This appellation was given to them because they were so feared and dreaded that people dared not call them by their proper title, and hoped by this means to propitiate their wrath. In later times, the Furies came to be regarded as salutary agencies, who, by severely punishing sin, upheld the cause of morality and social order, and thus contributed to the welfare of mankind. They now lose their awe-inspiring aspect, and are represented, more especially in Athens, as earnest maidens, dressed, like Artemis, in short tunics suitable for the chase, but still retaining in their hands the wand of office in the form of a snake. Their sacrifices consisted of black sheep and a libation composed of a mixture of honey and water, called Nephalia. A celebrated temple was erected to the Eumenides at Athens, near the Areopagus. Moirai, or Fates, Parcae. The ancients believed that the duration of human existence and the destinies of mortals were regulated by three sister goddesses, called Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos, who were the daughters of Zeus and Thetis. The power which they wielded over the fate of man was significantly indicated under the figure of a thread, which they spun out for the life of each human being, from his birth to the grave. This occupation they divided between them. Clotho wound the flax round the distaff, ready for her sister Lachesis, who span out the thread of life, which Atropos, with her scissors, relentlessly snapped asunder when the career of an individual was about to terminate. Homer speaks of one Moira only, the daughter of Night, who represents the moral force by which the universe is governed, and to whom both mortals and immortals were forced to submit, Zeus himself being powerless to avert her decrees. But in later times this conception of one inexorable, all-conquering fate became amplified by the poets into that above described, and the Moirai are henceforth the special presiding deities over the life and death of mortals. The Moirai are represented by the poets as stern, inexorable female divinities, aged, hideous, and also lame, which is evidently meant to indicate the slow and halting march of destiny which they controlled. Painters and sculptors, on the other hand, depicted them as beautiful maidens of a grave but kindly aspect. There is a charming representation of Lachesis, which depicts her in all the grace of youth and beauty. She is sitting spinning, and at her feet lie two masks, one comic, the other tragic, as though to convey the idea that, to a divinity of fate, the brightest and saddest scenes of earthly existence are alike indifferent, and that she quietly and steadily pursues her occupation, regardless of human weal or woe. When represented at the feet of Aedes in the lower world, they are clad in dark robes, but when they appear in Olympus they wear bright garments, bespangled with stars, and are seated on radiant thrones with crowns on their heads. It was considered the function of the Moirai to indicate to the Furies the precise torture which the wicked should undergo for their crimes. They were regarded as prophetic divinities, and had sanctuaries in many parts of Greece. The Moirai are mentioned as assisting the Charites to conduct Persephone to the upper world at her periodical reunion with her mother Demeter. They also appear in company with Aletheia, goddess of birth. Nemesis. Nemesis, the daughter of Nyx, represents that power which adjusts the balance of human affairs by awarding to each individual the fate which his actions deserve. She rewards humble, unacknowledged merit, punishes crime, deprives the worthless of undeserved good fortune, humiliates the proud and overbearing, and visits all evil on the wrongdoer, thus maintaining that proper balance of things, which the Greeks recognized as a necessary condition of all civilized life. But though Nemesis, in her original character, was the distributor of rewards as well as punishments, the world was so full of sin that she found but little occupation in her first capacity, and hence became finally regarded as the avenging goddess only. We have seen a striking instance of the manner in which this divinity punishes the proud and arrogant in the history of Niobe. Apollo and Artemis were merely the instruments for avenging the insult offered to their mother, but it was Nemesis who prompted the deed and presided over its execution. Homer makes no mention of Nemesis. It is therefore evident that she was a conception of later times, when higher views of morality had obtained among the Greek nation. Nemesis is represented as a beautiful woman of thoughtful and benign aspect and regal bearing. A diadem crowns her majestic brow, and she bears in her hand a rudder, balance, and cubit, fitting emblems of the manner in which she guides, weighs, and measures all human events. She is also sometimes seen with a wheel, to symbolize the rapidity with which she executes justice. As the avenger of evil, she appears winged, bearing in her hand either a scourge or a sword, and seated in a chariot drawn by griffins. Nemesis is frequently called Adrastia, and also Rhamnusia, from Rhamnus in Attica, the chief seat of her worship, which contained a celebrated statue of the goddess. Nemesis was worshipped by the Romans, who invoked her on the Capitol, as a divinity who possessed the power of averting the pernicious consequences of envy. End of section 14.
Section 15 of Myths and Legends. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lucy LaFaro, New South Wales, Australia. Myths and Legends of Ancient Greece and Rome by EM Berens. Section 15, Third Dynasty. Night and her children. Nyx through Eros and Psyche. Nyx. Nox. Nyx, the daughter of Chaos, being the personification of night, was, according to the poetic ideas of the Greeks, considered to be the mother of everything mysterious and inexplicable, such as death, sleep, dreams, etc. She became united to Erebus, and their children were Ether and Hemera, air and daylight. Evidently, a simile of the poets, to indicate that darkness always precedes light. Nyx inhabited a palace in the dark regions of the lower world, and is represented as a beautiful woman seated in a chariot drawn by 2 black horses. She is clothed in dark robes, wears a long veil, and is accompanied by the stars, which follow in her train. Thanatos, Mors, and Hypnos, Somnus. Thanatos, Death, and his twin brother Hypnos, Sleep, were the children of Nyx. Their dwelling was in the realm of shades, and when they appear among mortals, Thanatos is feared and hated as the enemy of mankind, whose hard heart knows no pity, while his brother Hypnos is universally loved and welcomed as their kindest and most beneficent friend. But though the ancients regarded Thanatos as a gloomy and mournful divinity, they did not represent him with any exterior repulsiveness. On the contrary, he appears as a beautiful youth, who holds in his hand an inverted torch, emblematical of the light of life being extinguished, whilst his disengaged arm is thrown lovingly round the shoulder of his brother Hypnos. Hypnos is sometimes depicted standing erect with closed eyes. At others, he is in a recumbent position beside his brother Thanatos, and usually bears a poppy stalk in his hand. A most interesting description of the abode of Hypnos is given by Ovid in his Metamorphoses. He tells us how the god of sleep dwelt in a mountain cave near the realm of the Cimmerians, which the sun never pierced with his rays. No sound disturbed the stillness, no song of birds, not a branch moved, and no human voice broke the profound silence which reigned everywhere. From the lowermost rocks of the cave issued the river Lethe, and one might almost have supposed that its course was arrested, were it not for the low, monotonous hum of the water, which invited slumber. The entrance was partially hidden by numberless white and red poppies, which Mother Night had gathered and planted there, and from the juice of which she extracts drowsiness, which she scatters in liquid drops all over the earth as soon as the sun-god has sunk to rest. In the centre of the cave stands a couch of blackest ebony, with a bed of down, over which is laid a coverlet of sable hue. Here the god himself reposes, surrounded by innumerable forms. These are idle dreams, more numerous than the sands of the sea. Chief among them is Morpheus, that changeful god, who may assume any shape or form he pleases. Nor can the god of sleep resist his own power, for though he may rouse himself for a while, he soon succumbs to the drowsy influences which surround him. Morpheus, the son of Hypnos, was the god of dreams. He is always represented winged, and appears sometimes as a youth, sometimes as an old man. In his hand he bears a cluster of poppies, and as he steps with noiseless footsteps over the earth, he gently scatters the seeds of this sleep-producing plant over the eyes of weary mortals. Homer describes the house of dreams as having two gates, one whence issue all deceptive and flattering visions, being formed of ivory, the other through which proceed those dreams which are fulfilled, of horn. The Gorgons. The Gorgons, Stheno, Euryale, and Medusa, were the three daughters of Phorcys and Ceto, and were the personification of those benumbing and, as it were, petrifying sensations which result from sudden and extreme fear. They were frightful winged monsters, whose bodies were covered with scales. Hissing, wriggling snakes cluttered round their heads instead of hair. Their hands were of brass, their teeth resembled the tusks of a wild boar, and their whole aspect was so appalling that they are said to have turned into stone all who beheld them. These terrible sisters were supposed to dwell in that remote and mysterious region in the far west, beyond the sacred stream of Oceanus. The Gorgons were the servants of Hades, who made use of them to terrify and overawe those shades, doomed to be kept in a constant state of unrest as a punishment for their misdeeds, whilst the Furies, on their part, scourged them with their whips and tortured them incessantly. The most celebrated of the three sisters was Medusa, who alone was mortal. She was originally a golden-haired and very beautiful maiden, who, as a priestess of Athene, was devoted to a life of celibacy. But, being wooed by Poseidon, whom she loved in return, she forgot her vows, and became united to him in marriage. For this offence she was punished by the goddess in a most terrible manner. Each wavy lock of the beautiful hair, which had so charmed her husband, was changed into a venomous snake. Her once gentle, love-inspiring eyes now became bloodshot, furious orbs, which excited fear and disgust in the mind of the beholder, whilst her former roseate hue and milk-white skin assumed a loathsome green tinge. Seeing herself thus transformed into so repulsive an object, Medusa fled from her home, never to return. Wandering about, abhorred, dreaded, and shunned by all the world, she now developed into a character worthy of her outward appearance. In her despair, she fled to Africa, where, as she passed restlessly from place to place, infant snakes dropped from her hair, and thus, according to the belief of the ancients, that country became the hotbed of these venomous reptiles. With the curse of Athene upon her, she turned into stone whomsoever she gazed upon, till at last, after a life of nameless misery, deliverance came to her in the shape of death at the hands of Perseus. It is well to observe that when the Gorgons are spoken of in the singular, it is Medusa who is alluded to. Medusa was the mother of Pegasus and Chrysaor, father of the three-headed winged giant Geryones, who was slain by Heracles. Grii. The Grii, who acted as servants to their sisters the Gorgons, were also three in number. Their names were Perfredo, Enyo, and Dino. In their original conception they were merely personifications of kindly and venerable old age, possessing all its benevolent attributes without its natural infirmities. They were old and grey from their birth, and so they ever remained. In later times, however, they came to be regarded as misshapen females, decrepit and hideously ugly, having only one eye, one tooth, and one grey wig between them, which they lent to each other, when one of them wished to appear before the world. When Perseus entered upon this expedition to slay the Medusa, he repaired to the abode of the Grii, in the far west, to inquire the way to the Gorgons, and on their refusing to give any information, he deprived them of their one eye, tooth, and wig, and did not restore them until he received the necessary directions. Sphinx. The Sphinx was an ancient Egyptian divinity who personified wisdom and the fertility of nature. She is represented as a lion couchant, with the head and bust of a woman, and wears a peculiar sort of hood which completely envelops her head and falls down on either side of the face. Transplanted into Greece, this sublime and mysterious Egyptian deity degenerates into an insignificant and yet malignant power, and though she also deals in mysteries, they are, as we shall see, of a totally different character and altogether inimical to human life. The Sphinx is represented, according to Greek genealogy, as the offspring of Typhon and Echidna. Hera, being upon one occasion displeased with the Thebans, sent them this awful monster as a punishment for their offences. Taking her seat on a rocky eminence near the city of Thebes, commanding a pass which the Thebans were compelled to traverse in their usual way of business, she propounded to all comers a riddle, and if they failed to solve it, she tore them in pieces. During the reign of King Creon, so many people had fallen a sacrifice to this monster that he determined to use every effort to rid the country of so terrible a scourge. On consulting the oracle of Delphi, he was informed that the only way to destroy the Sphinx was to solve one of her riddles, when she would immediately precipitate herself from the rock on which she was seated. Creon accordingly made a public declaration to the effect that whoever could give the true interpretation of a riddle propounded by the monster should obtain the crown and the hand of his sister Ch16. Oedipus offered himself as a candidate, and, proceeding to the spot where she kept guard, received from her the following riddle for solution. What creature goes in the morning on 4 legs, at noon on 2, and in the evening on 3? Oedipus replied that it must be man, who during his infancy creeps on all fours, in his prime walks erect on 2 legs, and when old age has enfeebled his powers, calls a staff to his assistance, and thus has, as it were, 3 legs. The Sphinx no sooner heard this reply, which was the correct solution of her riddle, than she flung herself over the precipice and perished in the abyss below. The Greek Sphinx may be recognized by having wings and by being of smaller dimensions than the Egyptian Sphinx. Tyche, Fortuna, and Ananke, Necessitas. Tyche Fortuna. Tyche personified that peculiar combination of circumstances which we call luck or fortune, and was considered to be the source of all unexpected events in human life, whether good or evil. If a person succeeded in all he undertook without possessing any special merit of his own, Tyche was supposed to have smiled on his birth. If, on the other hand, undeserved ill luck followed him through life, and all his efforts resulted in failure, it was ascribed to her adverse influence. This goddess of fortune is variously represented. Sometimes she is depicted bearing in her hand 2 rudders. with one of which she steers the bark of the fortunate, and with the other that of the unfortunate among mortals. In later times she appears blindfolded, and stands on a ball or wheel, indicative of the fickleness of ever-revolving changes of fortune. She frequently bears the sceptre and cornucopia, or horn of plenty, and is usually winged. In her temple at Thebes, she is represented holding infant Plutus in her arms, to symbolize her power over riches and prosperity. Tyche was worshipped in various parts of Greece, but more particularly by the Athenians, who believed in her special predilection for their city, Fortuna. Tyche was worshipped in Rome under the name of Fortuna, and held a position of much greater importance among the Romans than the Greeks. In later times, Fortuna is never represented either winged or standing on a ball. She merely bears the cornucopia. It is evident, therefore, that she had come to be regarded as the goddess of good luck only, who brings blessings to man, and not, as with the Greeks, as the personification of the fluctuations of fortune. In addition to Fortuna, the Romans worshipped Felicitas as the river of positive good fortune. Ananke, necessitas. As Ananke, Tyche assumes quite another character, and becomes the embodiment of those immutable laws of nature, by which certain causes produce certain inevitable results. In a statue of this divinity at Athens, she was represented with hands of bronze, and surrounded with nails and hammers. The hands of bronze probably indicated the irresistible power of the inevitable, and the hammer and chains the fetters which she forged for man. Ananke was worshipped in Rome under the name of Necessitas. Ch. In addition to the Moirai, who presided over the life of mortals, there was another divinity called Ch, appointed for each human being at the moment of his birth. The Ch, belonging to an individual, was believed to develop with his growth, either for good or evil, and when the ultimate fate of a mortal was about to be decided, his Ch was weighed in the balance, and, according to the preponderance of its worth or worthlessness, life or death was awarded to the human being in question. It becomes evident, therefore, that according to the belief of the early Greeks, each individual had in his power, to a certain extent, to shorten or prolong his own existence. The Keres, who are frequently mentioned by Homer, were the goddesses who delighted in the slaughter of the battlefield. Aete. Aete, the daughter of Zeus and Eris, was a divinity who delighted in evil. Having instigated Hera to deprive Heracles of his birthright, her father seized her by the hair of her head and hurled her from Olympus, forbidding her under the most solemn imprecations ever to return. Henceforth she wandered among mankind, sowing dissension, working mischief, and luring men to all actions inimical to their welfare and happiness. Hence, when a reconciliation took place between friends who had quarrelled, Aete was blamed as the original cause of disagreement. Momus. Momus, the son of Nyx, was the god of raillery and ridicule, who delighted to criticize, with bitter sarcasm, the actions of gods and men, and contrived to discover in all things some defect or blemish. Thus, when Prometheus created the first man, Momus considered his work incomplete because there was no aperture in the breast through which his inmost thoughts might be read. He also found fault with the house built by Athene, because being unprovided with the means of locomotion, it could never be removed from an unhealthy locality. Aphrodite alone defied his criticism, for, to his great chagrin, he could find no fault with her perfect form. In what manner the ancients represented this god is unknown. In modern art, he is depicted like a king's jester, with a fool's cap and bells. Eros, Cupid, Amor, and Psyche. According to Hesiod's Theogony, Eros, the divine spirit of love, sprang forth from chaos, while all was still in confusion, and by his beneficent power reduced to order and harmony the shapeless conflicting elements, which, under his influence, began to assume distinct forms. This ancient Eros is represented as a full-grown and very beautiful youth, crowned with flowers and leaning on a shepherd's crook. In the course of time, this beautiful conception gradually faded away, and though occasional mention still continues to be made of the Eros of chaos, he is replaced by the son of Aphrodite, the popular, mischief-loving little god of love, so familiar to us all. In one of the myths concerning Eros, Aphrodite is described as complaining to Thetis that her son, though so beautiful, did not appear to increase in stature, whereupon Thetis suggested that his small proportions were probably attributable to the fact of his being always alone, and advised his mother to let him have a companion. Aphrodite accordingly gave him as a playfellow his younger brother Anteros, requited love, and soon had the gratification of seeing the little Eros begin to grow and thrive. But curious to relate, this desirable result only continued as long as the brothers remained together. For the moment they were separated, Eros shrank once more to his original size. By degrees the conception of Eros became multiplied, and we hear of little love-gods, amors, who appear under the most charming and diversified forms. These love-gods, who afforded to artists inexhaustible subjects for the exercise of their imagination, are represented as being engaged in various occupations, such as hunting, fishing, rowing, driving chariots, and even busying themselves in mechanical labour. Perhaps no myth is more charming and interesting than that of Eros and Psyche, which is as follows. Psyche, the youngest of three princesses, was so transcendently beautiful that Aphrodite herself became jealous of her, and no mortal dared to aspire to the honour of her hand. As her sisters, who were by no means equal to her in attractions, were married, and Psyche still remained unwedded, her father consulted the oracle of Delphi, and, in obedience to the divine response, caused her to be dressed as though for the grave, and conducted to the edge of a yawning precipice. No sooner was she alone than she felt herself lifted up and wafted away by the gentle west wind Zephyrus, who transported her to a verdant meadow, in the midst of which stood a stately palace, surrounded by groves and fountains. Here dwelt Eros, the god of love, in whose arms Zephyrus deposited his lovely burden. Eros, himself unseen, wooed her in the softest accents of affection, but warned her, as she valued his love, not to endeavour to behold his form. For some time Psyche was obedient to the injunction of her immortal spouse, and made no effort to gratify her natural curiosity. But unfortunately, in the midst of her happiness, she was seized with an unconquerable longing for the society of her sisters, and, in accordance with her desire, they were conducted by Zephyrus to her fairy-like abode. Filled with envy at the sight of her felicity, they poisoned her mind against her husband, and telling her that her unseen lover was a frightful monster, they gave her a sharp dagger, which they persuaded her to use for the purpose of delivering herself from his power. After the departure of her sisters, Psyche resolved to take the first opportunity of following their malicious counsel. She accordingly rose in the dead of night, and taking a lamp in one hand and a dagger in the other, stealthily approached the couch where Eros was reposing, when, instead of the frightful monster she had expected to see, the beauteous form of the god of love greeted her view. Overcome with surprise and admiration, Psyche stooped down to gaze more closely on his lovely features, when, from the lamp which she held in her trembling hand, there fell a drop of burning oil upon the shoulder of the sleeping god, who instantly awoke, and seeing Psyche standing over him with the instrument of death in her hand, sorrowfully reproached her for her treacherous designs, and, spreading out his wings, flew away. In despair at having lost her lover, the unhappy Psyche endeavoured to put an end to her existence by throwing herself into the nearest river, but instead of closing over her, the waters bore her gently to the opposite bank, where Pan, the god of shepherds, received her, and consoled her with the hope of becoming eventually reconciled to her husband. Meanwhile, her wicked sisters, in expectation of meeting with the same good fortune which had befallen Psyche, placed themselves on the edge of the rock, but were both precipitated into the chasm below. Psyche herself, filled with a restless yearning for her lost love, wandered all over the world in search of him. At length she appealed to Aphrodite to take compassion on her, but the goddess of beauty, still jealous of her charms, imposed upon her the hardest tasks, the accomplishment of which often appeared impossible. In these she was always assisted by invisible beneficent beings sent to her by Eros, who still loved her and continued to watch over her welfare. Psyche had to undergo a long and severe penance before she became worthy to regain the happiness which she had so foolishly trifled away. At last, Aphrodite commanded her to descend into the underworld and obtain from Persephone a box containing all the charms of beauty. Psyche's courage now failed her, for she concluded that death must, of necessity, precede her entrance into the realm of shades. About to abandon herself to despair, she heard a voice which warned her of every danger to be avoided on her perilous journey, and instructed her with regard to certain precautions to be observed. These were as follows: not to omit to provide herself with the ferryman's toll for Charon, and the cake to pacify Cerberus. Also, to refrain from taking any part in the banquets of Hades and Persephone, and, above all things, to bring the box of beauty charms unopened to Aphrodite. In conclusion, the voice assured her that compliance with the above conditions would ensure for her a safe return to the realms of light. But, alas, Psyche, who had implicitly followed all injunctions, could not withstand the temptation of the last condition, and hardly had she quitted the lower world, when, unable to resist the curiosity which devoured her, she raised the lid of the box with eager expectation. But, instead of the wondrous charms of beauty which she expected to behold, there issued from the casket a dense black vapour, which had the effect of throwing her into a death-like sleep, out of which Eros, who had long hovered round her unseen, at length awoke her with the point of one of his golden arrows. He gently reproached her with this second proof of her curiosity and folly, and then, having persuaded Aphrodite to be reconciled to his beloved, he induced Zeus to admit her among the immortal gods. Their reunion was celebrated amidst the rejoicings of all the Olympian deities. The Graces shed perfume on their path. The Hours sprinkled roses over the sky. Apollo added the music of his lyre, and the Muses united their voices in a glad chorus of delight. This myth would appear to be an allegory, which signifies that the soul, before it can be reunited to its original divine essence, must be purified by the chastening sorrows and sufferings of its earthly career. Eros is represented as a lovely boy, with rounded limbs and a merry, roguish expression. He has golden wings and a quiver slung over his shoulder, which contained his magical and unerring arrows. In one hand he bears his golden bow, and in the other a torch. He is also frequently depicted riding on a lion, dolphin, or eagle, or seated in a chariot drawn by stags or wild boars. Undoubtedly emblematical of the power of love as the subduer of all nature, even of the wild animals. In Rome, Eros is worshipped under the name of Amor or Cupid. End of section 15. Section 16 of Myths and Legends. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lucy LaFaro, New South Wales, Australia. Myths and Legends of Ancient Greece and Rome by EM Berens. Section 16. Third Dynasty, Night and Her Children. Hymen through the Charities or Graces. Hymen. Hymen, or Hymenaeus, the son of Apollo and the muse Urania, was the god who presided over marriage and nuptial solemnities, and was hence invoked at all marriage festivities. There is a myth concerning this divinity, which tells us that Hymen was a beautiful youth of very poor parents, who fell in love with a wealthy maiden, so far above him in rank that he dared not cherish the hope of ever becoming united to her. Still, he missed no opportunity of seeing her, and upon one occasion disguised himself as a girl, and joined a troop of maidens, who, in company with his beloved, were proceeding from Athens to Eleusis, in order to attend a festival of Demeter. On their way thither, they were surprised by pirates, who carried them off to a desert island, where the ruffians, after drinking deeply, fell into a heavy sleep. Hymen, seizing the opportunity, slew them all, and then set sail for Athens, where he found the parents of the maidens in the greatest distress at their unaccountable disappearance. He comforted them with the assurance that their children should be restored to them, provided they would promise to give him in marriage the maiden he loved. The condition being gladly complied with, he at once returned to the island and brought back the maidens in safety to Athens, whereupon he became united to the object of his love, and their union proved so remarkably happy that henceforth the name of Hymen became synonymous with conjugal felicity. Iris, the rainbow. Iris, the daughter of Thaumas and Electra, personified the rainbow, and was the special attendant and messenger of the Queen of Heaven, whose commands she executed with singular tact, intelligence, and swiftness. Most primitive nations have regarded the rainbow as a bridge of communication between heaven and earth, and this is doubtless the reason why Iris, who represented that beautiful phenomenon of nature, should have been invested by the Greeks with the office of communicating between gods and men. Iris is usually represented seated behind the chariot of Hera, ready to do the bidding of her royal mistress. She appears under the form of a slender maiden of great beauty, robed in an airy fabric of variegated hues, resembling mother of pearl. Her sandals are bright as burnished silver. She has golden wings, and wherever she appears, a radiance of light and a sweet odour, as of delicate spring flowers, pervades the air. Hebe, Juventus. Hebe was the personification of eternal youth under its most attractive and joyous aspect. She was the daughter of Zeus and Hera, and though of such distinguished rank, is nevertheless represented as cupbearer to the gods, a forcible exemplification of the old patriarchal custom, in accordance with which the daughters of the house, even when of the highest lineage, personally assisted in serving the guests. Hebe is represented as a comely, modest maiden, small, of a beautifully rounded contour, with nut-brown tresses and sparkling eyes. She is often depicted pouring out nectar from an upraised vessel, or bearing in her hand a shallow dish, supposed to contain ambrosia, the ever youth-renewing food of the immortals. In consequence of an act of awkwardness, which caused her to slip while serving the gods, Hebe was deprived of her office, which was henceforth delegated to Ganymedes, son of Tros. Hebe afterwards became the bride of Heracles, when, after his apotheosis, he was received among the immortals. Juventus. Juventus was the Roman divinity identified with Hebe, whose attributes, however, were regarded by the Romans as applying more particularly to the imperishable vigour and immortal glory of the state. In Rome, several temples were erected in the honour of this goddess. Ganymedes. Ganymedes, the youngest son of Tros, king of Troy, was one day drawing water from a well on Mount Ida, when he was observed by Zeus, who, struck with his wonderful beauty, sent his eagle to transport him to Olympus, where he was endowed with immortality, and appointed cup-bearer to the gods. Ganymedes is represented as a youth of exquisite beauty, with short golden locks, delicately chiselled features, beaming blue eyes, and pouting lips. The Muses. Of all the Olympic deities, none occupy a more distinguished position than the Muses, the 9 beautiful daughters of Zeus and Mnemosyne. In their original signification, they presided merely over music, song, and dance. But with the progress of civilization, the arts and sciences claimed their special presiding divinities, and we see these graceful creations in later times, sharing among them various functions such as poetry, astronomy, etc. The Muses were honoured alike by mortals and immortals. In Olympus, where Apollo acted as their leader, no banquet or festivity was considered complete without their joy-inspiring presence, and on earth no social gathering was celebrated without libations being poured out to them, nor was any task involving intellectual effort ever undertaken without earnestly supplicating their assistance. They endowed their chosen favourites with knowledge, wisdom, and understanding. They bestowed upon the orator the gift of eloquence, inspired the poet with his noblest thoughts, and the musician with his sweetest harmonies. Like so many of the Greek divinities, however, the refined conception of the Muses is somewhat marred by the acerbity with which they punished any effort on the part of mortals to rival them in their divine powers. An instance of this is seen in the case of Thamyris, a Thracian bard, who presumed to invite them to a trial of skill in music. Having vanquished him, they not only afflicted him with blindness, but deprived him also of the power of song. Another example of the manner in which the gods punished presumption and vanity is seen in the story of the daughters of King Pyrrhus. Proud of the perfection to which they had brought their skill in music, they presumed to challenge the Muses themselves in the art over which they especially presided. The contest took place on Mount Helicon, and it is said that when the mortal maidens commenced their song, the sky became dark and misty, whereas when the Muses raised their heavenly voices, all nature seemed to rejoice, and Mount Helicon itself moved with exultation. The Pleiades were signally defeated, and were transformed by the Muses into singing birds, as a punishment for having dared to challenge comparison with the immortals. Undeterred by the above example, the Sirens also entered into a similar contest. The songs of the Muses were loyal and true, whilst those of the Sirens were the false and deceptive strains with which so many unfortunate mariners had been lured to their death. The Sirens were defeated by the Muses, and as a mark of humiliation were deprived of the feathers with which their bodies were adorned. The oldest seat of the worship of the Muses was Pieria in Thrace. where they were supposed to have first seen the light of day. Pieria is a district on one of the sloping declivities of Mount Olympus, whence a number of rivulets, as they flow towards the plains beneath, produce those sweet, soothing sounds which may possibly have suggested this spot as a fitting home for the presiding divinities of song. They dwelt on the summits of Mount Helicon, Parnassus and Pindus, and loved to haunt the springs and fountains which gushed forth amidst these rocky heights, all of which were sacred to them and to poetic inspiration. Aganippe and Hippocrene on Mount Helicon, and the Castilian spring on Mount Parnassus were sacred to the Muses. The latter flowed between two lofty rocks above the city of Delphi, and in ancient times its waters were introduced into a square stone basin, where they were retained for the use of Pythia and the priests of Apollo. The libations to these divinities consisted of water, milk, and honey, but never of wine. Their names and functions are as follows. Calliope, the most honoured of the Muses, presided over heroic song and epic poetry, and is represented with a pencil in her hand and a slate upon her knee. Clio, the muse of history, holds in her hand a roll of parchment and wears a wreath of laurel. Melpomene, the muse of tragedy, bears a tragic mask. Thalia, the muse of comedy, carries in her right hand a shepherd's crook and has a comic mask beside her. Polyhymnia, the muse of sacred hymns, is crowned with a wreath of laurel. She is always represented in a thoughtful attitude and entirely enveloped in rich folds of drapery. Terpsichore, the muse of dance and roundelay, is represented in the act of playing on a 7-stringed lyre. Urania, the muse of astronomy, stands erect and bears in her left hand a celestial globe. Euterpe, the muse of harmony, is represented bearing a musical instrument, usually a flute. Erato, the muse of love and hymeneal songs, wears a wreath of laurel and is striking the chords of a lyre. With regard to the origin of the Muses, it is said that they were created by Zeus in answer to a request on the part of the victorious deities, after the war with the Titans, that some special divinities should be called into existence in order to commemorate in song the glorious deeds of the Olympian gods. Pegasus. Pegasus was a beautiful winged horse who sprang from the body of Medusa when she was slain by the hero Perseus, the son of Zeus and Danae. Spreading out his wings, he immediately flew to the top of Mount Olympus, where he was received with delight and admiration by all the immortals. A place in his palace was assigned to him by Zeus, who employed him to carry his thunder and lightning. Pegasus permitted none but the gods to mount him, except in the case of Bellerophon, whom, at the command of Athene, he carried aloft, in order that he might slay the Chimera with his arrows. The later poets represent Pegasus as being at the service of the Muses, and for this reason he is more celebrated in modern times than in antiquity. He would appear to represent that poetical inspiration which tends to develop man's higher nature and causes the mind to soar heavenwards. The only mention of the ancients of Pegasus in connection with the Muses is the story of his having produced with his hoofs the famous fountain Hippocrene. It is said that during their contest with the Parides, the Muses played and sang on the summit of Mount Helicon with such extraordinary power and sweetness that heaven and earth stood still to listen, whilst the mountain raised itself in joyous ecstasy towards the abode of the celestial gods. Poseidon, seeing his special function thus interfered with, sent Pegasus to check the boldness of the mountain, in daring to move without his permission. When Pegasus reached the summit, he stamped the foot with his hoofs, and out gushed the waters of Hippocrene, afterwards so renowned as the sacred fount, whence the Muses quaffed their richest draughts of inspiration. The Hesperides. The Hesperides, the daughters of Atlas, dwelt in an island in the far west, whence they derived their name. They were appointed by Hera to act as guardians to a tree bearing golden apples, which had been presented to her by Gaia on the occasion of her marriage with Zeus. It is said that the Hesperides, being unable to withstand the temptation of tasting the golden fruit confided to their care, were deprived of their office, which was henceforth delegated to the terrible dragon Ladon, who now became the ever-watchful sentinel of these precious treasures. The names of the Hesperides were Eagle, Arethusa, and Hesperia. Charities. Gratii, graces. All those gentler attributes which beautify and refine human existence were personified by the Greeks under the form of three lovely sisters, Euphrosyne, Aglaia, and Thalia, the daughters of Zeus and Eurynomé, or according to later writers, of Dionysus and Aphrodite. They are represented as beautiful slender maidens in the full bloom of youth, with hands and arms lovingly intertwined, and are either undraped or wear a fleecy, transparent garment of an ethereal fabric. They portray every gentle emotion of the heart, which vents itself in friendship and benevolence, and were believed to preside over those qualities which constitute grace, modesty, unconscious beauty, gentleness, kindliness, innocent joy, purity of mind and body, and eternal youth. They not only possessed the most perfect beauty themselves, but also conferred this gift upon others. All the enjoyments of life were enhanced by their presence, and were deemed incomplete without them, and wherever joy or pleasure, grace and gaiety reigned, there they were supposed to be present. Temples and altars were everywhere erected in their honour, and people of all ages and every rank in life entreated their favour. Incense was burnt daily upon their altars, and at every banquet they were invoked, and a libation poured out to them, as they not only heightened all enjoyment, but also, by their refining influence, moderated the exciting effects of wine. Music, eloquence, poetry, and art, though the direct work of the Muses, received at the hands of the Graces an additional touch of refinement and beauty, for which reason they are always regarded as the friends of the Muses, with whom they lived on Mount Olympus. Their special function was to act, in conjunction with the seasons, as attendants upon Aphrodite, whom they adorned with wreaths of flowers, and she emerges from their hands like the queen of spring, perfumed with the odour of roses and violets, and all sweet-scented blossoms. The Graces are frequently seen in attendance on other divinities. Thus they carry music for Apollo, myrtles for Aphrodite, etc., and frequently accompany the Muses, Eros or Dionysus. End of section 16.